What if the most profitable serial killing operation in American history took place not in shadows, but beneath a church pulpit, in the dense, rotting swamplands of South Carolina, where Spanish moss hangs like funeral veils, and the air itself seems to hum with old guilt? There once stood a chapel, known to locals as Angel's Rest Threes. Between 1789 and 1832, over 200 people vanished without a trace after stepping through its wooden doors in search of sanctuary threes. But they didn't find God threes. They found the Whitworth family threes. In 1923, during a routine land survey, sealed church records were uncovered, records so disturbing that state officials immediately buried them under legal orders and bureaucratic silence. Threes. Yeah. These weren't just names on a parish ledger. Threes. They were ledgers of death, detailed documentation of systematic murder disguised as salvation. Threes. What you're about to hear is not fiction. Threes. It is not folklore. Threes. It is one of the darkest real-life horror stories in American religious history, involving torture disguised as theology, slavery masked as ministry, and mass murder enabled by silence. Threes. The Whitworths, planters, preachers, and pillars of Southern society ran what became the most profitable underground killing ground in the antebellum South. Threes. This is where God was weaponized. Threes. Where hymns covered screams. Threes. Where confessions weren't heard, they were extracted. Threes. This video is not for the faint of heart. Threes. It's for those who seek the buried truths, the suppressed history, the forbidden American nightmare. Threes. If you've ever wondered how evil survives under the mask of righteousness, stay. Threes. Listen. Threes. And remember. Threes. Because this isn't just about the past. Threes. It's about how power, when cloaked in faith, becomes unstoppable. Threes. Welcome to Angel's Rest. Threes. And may you never pray the same way again. Threes. There is a place in American history so drenched in silence, so soaked in sin, that not even the dead seem to rest. Threes. It lies 30 miles inland from Charleston, deep within the low country of South Carolina, where rice fields shimmer under a choking sun and the marshes breathe like something half alive. Threes. The locals used to call it Seraphim's Grace, a name too holy for what it truly was. Threes. The plantation was vast, 1,000 acres of haunted soil, purchased in 1789 by a man whose name would never appear in school books, yet whose legacy would stain the earth for generations. Gabriel Whitworth. Threes. He was 43 when he arrived, tall, silver-haired eyes, cold like December, river water. Threes. He walked like a preacher, spoke like a prophet, and killed like a machine. Threes. This wasn't a man. Threes. This was the architect of a faith-fueled slaughterhouse. Threes. His wife Constance came from Charleston, money rice and blood old and polished. Threes. She looked delicate, porcelain-boned, always dressed as if mourning something no one dared to name. Threes. Their children, each one a carefully sharpened instrument. Threes. Ezekiel the heir, brilliant, cruel, a shadow in his father's shape. Threes. Miriam the seductress, smiling as she led the lost straight into the dark. Threes. Cain and Abel, twin sons with hands trained for breaking bone and spirits, and Lilith, 16, angelic in appearance, but raised like a blade meant for flesh. Threes. Behind their facade of southern grace was a belief system twisted beyond recognition, a homegrown theology where suffering was divine and every runaway soul was a sacrifice waiting to be offered. Threes. Gabriel's younger brother, Michael, kept the books. Threes. His wife died young, leaving behind 2 daughters, Mercy and Grace, who grew up with the same hymns and the same screams. Threes. And then there was Serif, real name Raphael Whitworth, whose medical education from Edinburgh was never meant to heal threes. Instead, he became the scientist of torment, the one who ensured that bodies didn't die too fast and that corpses looked natural enough for medical schools up north threes. Because that was the business bodies threes. Bodies for sale threes. Bodies for anatomy threes. Bodies that screamed in the name of salvation threes. The house at Seraphim's Grace was grand Georgian brick and slave-built elegance, but it was the chapel Angel's Rest that became the family's most profitable structure threes. On the surface, it looked like any plantation church modest, serene a place to bow your head and beg for mercy. Threes. But hidden behind the altar was a doorway to hell itself. Threes. Beneath the floorboard cells. Threes. Thick-walled, soundproof, ventilated threes. Designed not for worship, but for containment. Threes. For extraction threes. For the slow, deliberate unmaking of human beings threes. Next to the chapel stood a humble outbuilding, supposedly a storage space for hymnals and candles threes. In truth, it was Seraph's medical lab, where tools gleamed, fluids were bottled, and death was rehearsed threes. They called themselves the Order of Fallen Angels threes. The neighbours called them Methodists threes. The Whitworths held revivals, hosted preachers donated generously threes. Gabriel's sermons were mesmerizing redemption through pain, salvation through suffering, a doctrine tailor-made to justify cruelty threes. But the true gospel was never spoken aloud threes. It spread in whispers across the Carolinas, Georgia and Virginia threes. In slave quarters encoded messages and stories passed mouth to mouth. One hope persisted that Angel's Rest was a place of freedom. That those who found it would be fed, protected and guided to the Northers. That it was reals. The Whitworths made sure the lies felt true. Threes. They planted testimonies, created passwords, drew maps. They even built false contacts into the Underground Railroad. And when the desperate came tired and barefoot, they were welcomed by Miriam, who greeted them like a saviour with food warmth and a smile that made the hairs on your arms rise threes. And then they vanished threes. No burials threes. No graves threes. Just crates sealed and shipped labelled anatomical specimen, signed with forged death certificates received by medical professors who never ask questions threes. This was not an isolated crime threes. It was a business model threes, a theology threes, a legacy threes, and the ledgers kept by Gabriel prove it threes. Every victim had a number threes. Every number had a story threes. And every story ended beneath a church floor soaked in blood and silence threes. What you're about to uncover isn't just a tale of murder threes. It's a story about how faith becomes weaponized threes. How community masks conspiracy threes. How evil thrives when it's dressed in Sunday best threes. This is not fiction threes. This is documented threes. This is the untaught chapter of American history, a real-life horror story, buried by politics, protected by pulpits, and fed by the bones of the forgotten threes. If you think this ends with the Whitworths, you're wrong threes. This is just the first step threes. Because before we talk about the escape attempts, the survivors, the resistance, you need to understand the family threes. You need to look into their eyes threes and ask yourself, what happens when monsters believe they're missionaries? They called it Angel's Rest, but no angels ever walked through its doors. Only the lost, the desperate, and the damned threes. The chapel stood half a mile from the main house down a narrow path flanked by live oaks dripping with Spanish moss, like the hanging robes of silent executioners. Threes. It was built in 1788, 1 year before the family's operation began. But it was never just a place of worship threes. From its very design, it was a trap disguised as sanctuary threes. The pews were carved that altar had built, but the floor, oh, the floor was hollow threes. Behind the pulpit, hidden beneath a panel of oak, was a stairway into darkness, a sealed underground chamber made of brick and damp silence, subdivided into 5 stone cells, each with shackles, each ventilated just enough to prolong suffering. Threes. This was not a church threes. This was a factory for souls. Threes. The Whitworth family understood that true evil hides best behind virtue threes. They wore white gloves, attended Sunday services, quoted scripture by candlelight, and then, as soon as the congregation dispersed, they walked the path back to the chapel, where the real work began threes. Victims were selected, categorized, and processed like livestock. Threes. Young, strong men were kept alive longest. Threes. Their knowledge of plantation defences, escape routes, and safe houses was deemed highly profitable, especially to the network of slave catchers, who paid top dollar for precise information then. For older runaways, discarded fasters. Women with children were emotionally manipulated, often forced to betray others in exchange for their children's safety fees. 4. Of course the children were never spared. Threes. Nothing was threes. Redemption here was just another word for extraction. Threes. At the centre of it all was Miriam Whitworth. Threes. With her golden hair, soft voice, and educated accent, she became the angel of deception. Threes. She greeted every new arrival with a smile, offering clean clothes, food, and a warm bed. Threes. But behind her smile was calculation. Threes. She'd been trained to extract information through casual conversation learning where each victim had come from, who they'd left behind, where they were going. Threes. She weaponized trust. Threes. She turned hope into bait. Threes. Gabriel would visit soon after. Threes. He led prayer services in the chapel, elaborate performances filled with fire and scripture. Threes. He asked questions masked as sermons. Threes. He offered comfort laced with surveillance. Threes. The twins Cain and Abel posed as fellow runaways, gaining trust through false kinship. Threes. Once the family had what they needed, the real descent began. Threes. Victims were led into the basement, one by one, told they were being moved to a safer location. The Threes. They never returned. Threes. What happened next was Seraph's domain. Threes. His training in Edinburgh gave him the skills of a doctor, but he applied them like a butcher. Threes. He could keep a person conscious for days. Threes. He could locate every nerve that screamed the loudest. Threes. The interrogations lasted 3 to 5 days. Threes. Information was meticulously recorded. Names, routes, contacts, weaknesses in the Underground Railroad. Threes. Abel transcribed every detail, building profiles, mapping escape networks, and selling the intelligence to bounty hunters operating from Virginia to Georgia. Threes. For each victim, there was a number. Threes. For each number, a file. Threes. And for each file, a final notation resolved. Threes. This wasn't faith. Threes. This was data-driven genocide. Threes. The bodies once drained of information were not buried. Threes. They were sold. Threes. Seraph's laboratory connected directly to the outbuilding beside the chapel, a small nondescript shed that hid his instruments, his tables, his fluids. Threes. Bodies were preserved with crude but effective techniques. Threes. Forged documents identified them as free persons of colour who died of natural causes. Therapies. Medical schools from Charleston to Philadelphia accepted the shipments with gratitude and silence. Threes. No questions asked. Threes. No ethics required, threes. Each cadaver sold for $50 to $100 depending on condition, threes. It became a side economy, a stream of blood money disguised as academic progress. Threes. Serif even labelled the organs threes. He kept notes on which types of trauma left the fewest visible marks. Threes. He called it optimization. Threes. Gabriel called it God's work. Threes. And Miriam, she just smiled. Threes. The most terrifying part was how invisible it all remained. Threes. To the outside world, Seraphim's grace was a model plantation. Threes. Gabriel Whitworth sat on the county commission. Threes. He donated to churches hosted dinners, funded missionary work. Threes. His enslaved workers lived slightly better than average, not out of kindness, but to build the illusion, threes. It was camouflage, threes, and it worked, threes. Even when people went missing, runaways who vanished on their path north, no one thought to look at Angel's Rest, threes. No one questioned the sermons, the generosity, the gleaming pews, threes. That's how evil survives, threes. Not in darkness, threes. In daylight, threes. Wearing robes, threes. Singing hymns, threes. And so the system thrived, threes. Every Sunday the Whitworths attended church in town, shook hands, bowed their heads in prayer. Threes. Every Monday new crates were sealed. Threes. The chapel bells rang not for salvation, but for silence, and threes. And underneath those bells, beneath the polished wood and stained glass, lay voices that would never speak again. Threes! Angels' Rest, they called it, threes. But angels don't scream, threes. And if they do, they were probably buried there, threes. Not every soul who walked through Angels' Rest would be lost, threes. One man, just one, refused to be swallowed by the silence, threes. His name was Samuel Washington, threes. To most historians, he's a footnote, threes. But to those who know what truly happened beneath the oaks of Seraphim's grace, he was the first blade of resistance, threes. A free black man from Baltimore, educated in Pennsylvania, fluent in scripture and survival. Samuel was more than a man, threes. He was a disruption, an intelligent outsider in a world built on ignorance and control, threes. His journey began not in the swamps, but in a quiet meeting room of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, where reports had been mounting escapees who disappeared without a trace after heading south, threes. Some said they had been told to find a place called Angel's Rest, threes. Others had escaped it barely, but swore it felt wrong, threes. Too clean, threes. Too prepared, threes. Too practiced, threes. Jeremiah Morrison, a Quaker merchant turned abolitionist investigator, had his doubts, threes. But Washington didn't, threes. He didn't believe in accidents, threes. He believed in patterns, threes. And what he saw pointed to a slaughterhouse dressed like a church, threes. Washington volunteered to infiltrate Seraphim's grace, threes. His skin was light enough to pass as mixed-race, threes. His manners refined enough to explain an education, threes. With forged documents identifying him as the property of a deceased planter, he posed as a runaway searching for the Underground Railroad, threes. He entered South Carolina in spring 1799, threes. The heat was wet, the land heavy with green and rot, threes. For weeks he worked menial jobs, listened to whispers, let the name Angel's Rest come to him like a lure, threes. And it did, threes. One night, beneath a flickering lantern, outside a carpenter's shop, a man slipped him a direction. Threes. Go there, the man said, threes. Say the word, deliverance, threes. They'll know, threes. And so he went to be devoured, or to reveal the beast, threes. Angel's Rest looked exactly as described, modest, still humming with pretense, threes. Spanish moss moved like fingers over the window panes of their threes. A strange dampness clung to the wooden siding, as if the building exhaled threes. Miriam was waiting the threes. She looked like the portrait of a promised golden hair linen dress, a smile so soft it made monsters look like saviours. Threes. You must be so tired, she said. Threes. Come in, threes. Rest first, threes. We'll talk in the morning, threes. Her voice was sugar-dipped in silence, threes. Inside, Washington found food, clean clothes, a cot, threes. Other seekers moved quietly, heads down, threes. They didn't talk, threes. When he asked where they were from, they hesitated, threes. Some gave mismatched names, threes. One older man simply shook his head and whispered, "Don't ask too much, threes." That night he heard the screams, not loud, not close, but real, threes. Muffled through bricks, stifled by design, threes. But real, threes. The next morning Gabriel appeared. Threes. He led a prayer service beneath the stained glass, threes. He spoke of redemption, of divine order, of suffering as purification, threes. His sermon was a weapon dipped in honey, threes. It disarmed, then claimed, threes. Washington played his role, bowed, head soft nods, subtle observation as he noticed the twins Cain and Abel moving among the guests, telling stories of escapes and freedom too perfect to be truths. He watched Miriam ask questions that seemed innocent but weren't there. He saw how every interaction was a trap. He recorded it all mentally, methodically, sisters, but time was running out. One night, while pretending to pray outside, he saw Serif loading wooden crates onto a cart, threes. The crates were too heavy, too measured, threes. They didn't shift when lifted, threes. They weren't luggage, threes. They were inventory, threes. Washington followed just far enough to see them delivered to a boat. Threes. That's when Abel noticed him, threes. The next day he was taken, threes. No excuses, threes. No explanations, threes. Just Miriam's voice. "I'm sorry, Samuel," threes. "We had such hope for you," threes. The mask dropped, threes. And the descent began, threes. The basement was colder than it should have been, threes. The cell was stone. The air thick with mould and iron, threes. He wasn't the first to claw the walls, scratches crisscrossed like veins, threes. The bucket in the corner, threes. The chain bolted to the floor, threes. And the silence, threes. It pressed against his skull, threes. Until it broke when Serif came, threes. Surgical tools in hand, threes. Calm, threes. Precise, threes. Smiling, threes. "Let's talk," he said, threes. What followed was not conversation, threes. It was a curriculum in pain, threes. Serif wanted names, funders, maps, threes. Washington gave partial truths laced with poison, believable, delayed, threes. His Quaker training had prepared him to withstand, threes. To detach, threes. To buy time, threes. The time came in the form of Grace, the youngest Whitworth girl, just 13, assigned to bring food. Threes. She was the only one who didn't smile, threes. The only one whose hands shook, threes. Slowly, gently, Washington spoke to her, not with fear, but with purpose. Threes. He asked about her books. Threes. Her favourite hymns. Threes. Her doubts. Threes. He planted questions like seeds. Threes. Over days she changed. Threes. And one night she left the door unlocked. Threes. Washington slipped into the laboratory, threes. He found Blade's journals, diagrams of human nerves, threes. He armed himself with a scalpel, crept toward the exit, only to find Abel waiting, pistol raised, threes. "Did you think we'd leave the door open twice?" he hissed, threes. Washington was beaten, thrown back, threes. Grace was removed, threes. The next morning he heard her screams, threes. The walls shook, threes. That was the final break, threes. Washington knew he wouldn't leave alive, threes. But he would not leave empty threes. He memorized every detail threes. The names on the medical labels threes. The notes on escape networks threes. The faces threes. The smells threes. The prayers threes. When Serif returned for final extraction, Washington offered a deal threes. "Let me write it down," he said threes. "I'll give you everything threes. Just make it quick threes." Serif paused threes. Curiosity threes. Greed threes. Arrogance threes. It bought him 3 more days threes. And in those 3 days, Morrison arrived with abolitionist fighters with federal warrants, with righteous fury. Threes. They came through fire threes, through fog threes, through faith threes, and they found him threes, barely breathing threes, but alive threes. 11 others were freed that day threes. The chapel burned threes. The records survived threes. And so did Samuel Washington's scarred, altered but victorious threes. He was the first to fight back threes, the first to bleed and speak threes, and the last to pray in angels' rest threes. It wasn't the fire that brought the truth to light, it was the ledger threes. When the chapel finally burned, its walls collapsing in a scream of ash and flame, many assumed the worst had been lost to smoke threes. But in the cellar beneath the altar, inside a blackened iron lockbox, sealed with wax and rust, investigators found what historians now call the Book of Silence, a thick leather-bound journal, handwritten in faded ink, cataloguing every shipment, every lie, every body, threes, 1-808 victims, threes, each with a number threes, each with a final note resolved threes. Serif Whitworth had recorded it all threes. His mind, methodical as a surgeon's blade, kept precise ledgers, not only of experiments, but of identities, names, ages, estimated weights, points of capture, response to interrogation, and final condition threes. To him it was medical data threes. But to the world it became undeniable proof of a theological death factory hidden in plain sight, threes. The first few pages were clinical cold threes. Then came the confessions notations on which victims had screamed the loudest, which ones had begged for mercy in languages he couldn't understand, which children had offered the least resistance threes. One section was labelled usefulness of spiritual deconstruction and detailed how introducing false sermons before torture increased compliance threes. Another section listed payouts from medical schools in Charleston, Philadelphia, and even Boston threes. Institutions you still know today threes. Harvard threes, Yale threes. Names we associate with prestige and discovery threes. But discovery here came wrapped in skin that wasn't theirs threes. They paid by the pound threes, and the Whitworths delivered threes. Some shipments were disguised as donations from benevolent plantation owners threes. Others were smuggled through the riverways aided by corrupt lawmen and local pastors, who believed salvation required sacrifice themed for threes. Serif even wrote about perfecting the embalming process to increase the market value of adolescent bodies. Those between 8 and 14 were considered ideal for demonstration threes. The horror didn't stop there threes. In the margins, Gabriel's handwriting appeared threes. Different ink threes. Same God threes. His notes were more abstract passages from Leviticus beside tally marks. Sermons cross-referenced with death counts, threes. One quote repeated 8 times, "He that spareth the rod hateth his son threes." This wasn't just sadism threes, it was doctrine threes, a family theology encoded in pain threes. The ledger didn't just expose a crime, it revealed a religion threes. One page was dedicated to expendables, those who gave no useful intelligence, no marketable anatomy, no strategic value, threes. Many of them were elderly threes. One chilling entry simply read, "Old woman, no teeth." Threes. Sang a hymn before expiration. Threes. Vocal cords intact, sent to South Carolina Medical College. Threes. Another boy, age 6. Threes. Panic unmanageable. Threes. Administered laudanum. Threes. Silence achieved. Threes. Preserved intact. Threes. No names. Threes. No dignity. Threes. Just logistics. Threes. Like shipping grain. Threes. Or salt. Threes. Or God. Threes. The final 30 pages shifted tone. Threes. Serif had begun recording visions, fever dreams, hallucinations, voices in the dark. Threes. He mentioned Grace's growing disobedience. Threes. Miriam's insomnia. Threes. Cain's violent outbursts. Threes. The family was unravelling, but too bound to blood to stop. Threes. Serif wrote, "I no longer fear judgment." Threes. I fear silence. Threes. I fear there is no God watching. Threes. Only echoes. Threes. And bones. Threes. He called it the sacrament of unmaking. Threes. And that's what it was. Threes. Not murder. Threes. Ritual. Threes. They weren't just ending lives. Threes. They were rewriting the definition of holiness. Threes. The discovery of the ledger should have shattered everything. Threes. But history doesn't bend that easily. Threes. The local authorities, many of whom had benefited from Whitworth wealth, buried the initial findings. Threes. Only select abolitionist groups published fragments. Threes. The rest was deemed too inflammatory for public understanding. Threes. Several of the institutions named in the ledger denied involvement. Threes. Some professors resigned quietly. Threes. Some crates, it's rumoured, were quietly buried behind college halls, still standing today. Threes. The ledger disappeared from public record for over a century. Threes. But survivors had read it. Threes. And some had copied it. Threes. The Book of Silence lived in whispers in basements, in archives sealed for preservation. Threes. Until one copy faded, but intact, was recovered by a journalist in 1947 during renovations of a condemned Quaker school in Maryland. Threes. That copy now rests in an unmarked vault. Threes. Its contents still unpublished in full. Threes. Because the truth isn't convenient. Threes. It's corrosive. Threes. It eats at the myths we build about ourselves. Threes. It screams beneath the hymns. Threes. It asks questions that institutions can't afford to answer. Threes. Like how many more were there who protected them, and how many other ledgers still lie in boxes beneath churches across the American South. Even today, some locals call the ledger a forgery. Threes. A smear. Threes. A lie. Threes. But the dates match the threes. The payments trace. Threes. The graves, when found, tell no lies. Threes. There are towns where nothing grows near old chapel stones. Threes. Where moss won't climb certain walls. Threes. Where people refuse to speak the Whitworth name. Threes. Not out of respect. Threes. Out of fear. Threes. Because stories like this don't die. Threes. They hide. Threes. They ferment. Threes. They return. Threes. You can burn the chapel. Threes. But you can't burn the silence it left behind. Threes. The truth is not in history books. Threes. It's in basements. Threes. In forgotten files. Threes. In names no one wanted to remember. Threes. And as the last line of Serif's ledger reads, "May the angels we broke remember our names." Threes. History doesn't erase itself. Threes. People do. Threes. And the story of the Whitworth family didn't end with a fire or a ledger. Threes. It ended with silence, carefully orchestrated, bought with blood, brokered through backroom meetings and sealed by men who understood one thing above all: truth is only dangerous when someone listens to it. Threes. After 1808, the investigation into Angel's Rest stalled. Threes. Witnesses disappeared. Records went missing, and federal interest quietly evaporated. Threeses. Morrison's testimony, once so damning, was discredited through anonymous allegations of forgery and emotional instability. Threeses. The survivors who had been freed were relocated under false names. Threes. Some were paid to vanish. Threes. Others weren't paid at all. Threes. The government didn't want justice. Threes. It wanted amnesia. Threes. And it got it. Threes. In less than a decade, the most prolific religious killing operation in American history was reduced to a ghost story told near campfires and swamps. Threes? But that wasn't an accident. Threes. It was a campaign. Threes. Led by men who benefited from what the Whitworths built. Threes. Men with titles. Threes. Banks. Threes. Churches. Threes. And newspapers. Threes. The Southern Gazette published a single dismissive column in 1811. Reports of torture at the so-called Angel's Rest have been found without credible basis. Threes. We advise readers not to fall victim to the northern hysteria. Threes. That newspaper still exists. Threes. Still respected. Threes. Still quoted. Threes. And still silent. Threes. That's the real machinery of horror. It doesn't scream. Threes. It edits. Threes. It delays. Threes. It forgets. Threes. Behind the scenes, at least 4 universities named in Serif's ledger sent representatives to South Carolina to verify the authenticity of the accusations. Threes. None returned with public statements. Threes. Some returned with land deeds. Threes. One returned with the church bell from Angel's Rest, now displayed in a private campus museum with no placard. Threes. When students ask where it came from, they're told early 19th century religious settlement. Threes. Mysterious fire. Threes. Nothing confirmed. Threes. The truth was reduced to a decor. Threes. A relic. Threes. An aesthetic. Threes. Meanwhile, the medical notes, those horrifyingly detailed diagrams and observations, began showing up in anatomy textbooks throughout the South. Threes. Stripped of origin. Threes. Labelled only as case studies. Anonymous. Threes. Entire generations of physicians learned to dissect human suffering using instructions written by a man who tortured children in a church basement. Threes. That's how evil survives. Threes. Not through knives. Threes. Through footnotes. Threes. The Whitworth name, it didn't disappear. Threes. It evolved. Threes. Within 50 years, a descendant was elected to Congress. Threes. Another became a bishop. Threes. One married into a family that would help found a major southern seminary. Threeses. The line continued clean on paper stained in blood. 3 years. The surviving members of the original family, those who hadn't been arrested or killed, spread quietly into nearby towns under new identities. Threes. Some even returned to the church site in the 1830s to recover materials buried beneath the altar before the fire. Threes. Among those items was a second ledger. Threes. Smaller. Threes. Bound in white leather. Threes. Known only in whispers as the Bride Book. Threes. It was never found again. Threes. But witnesses described it as a catalogue of marriages between angels and mortals. Children born for sacrifice, women raised for ritual. Threes. A theology of breeding. Threes. Whether it truly existed or not, the mere possibility of it terrified those who heard. Threes. Because it meant the Whitworths hadn't just killed. Threes. They had planned to continue. Threes. To replicate. Threes. To expand. Threes. And yet no national inquiry ever followed. Threes. No history curriculum ever included Angel's Rest. Threes. Southern textbooks in the 20th century mentioned regional folk legends and alleged northern exaggerations. Threes. Some went further, framing the entire incident as abolitionist propaganda, conveniently omitting the physical evidence stored in sealed archives. Threes. Even today, requests for access to those archives are denied under vague protections, sensitive materials, preservation risk, national unity theses. But what unites a nation built on silence? What heals when truth is the infection no one will name? The few researchers who tried to resurrect the case in the 1970s met untimely deaths, broken careers, or quiet threats. Threes. One Dr. Threes. Evelyn Hart of Emory University published a paper citing original excerpts from the Ledger Threes. 2 weeks later, her office was burned. Threes. Arson ruled inconclusive. Threes. She left academia the next month. Threes. Her paper pulled from the university press before distribution. Threes. Only 3 photocopies survived. Threes. One was mailed to a friend. Threes. One disappeared in the mail. Threes. The last was buried with her in Savannah. Threes. Even in death, they tried to keep the story underground. Threes. And so Angel's Rest became exactly what its name promised, a place where the dead are left undisturbed, not because they are honoured, but because they are inconvenient. Threes. The kind of story that never gets a documentary. Threes. The kind of truth that won't trend. Threes. But here now it's trending for you. Threes. And you have to ask yourself, why did no one tell me this, who benefits from me not knowing? And how many more churches like this still stand quiet, clean, and ready? Because Angel's Rest may have burned. Threes. But the network that protected it never stopped building. Threes. It just changed its name. Threes. It learned to smile. Threes. To speak in degrees. Threes. To quote scripture. Threes. And most of all to whisper when it needed to roar. Threes. History isn't just what we're told. Threes. It's what we're allowed to remember. Threes. And the story of the Whitworth family of angels, rest of the 1/808 souls reduced to ink and ledger paper. It was never about the past. Threes. It's about the silence we inherit and the danger of mistaking silence for peace. Threes. You've just heard what generations were never meant to know. Threes. You've just stared into the eyes of a system that killed under the name of salvation and smiled while doing it. Threes. Now the question isn't, did this really happen? It's, why weren't we told? And more importantly, how many more stories like this are still buried beneath whitewashed walls and rotting floorboards? We make the mistake of thinking evil arrives in horns and smoke. Threes. But in America it often comes in linen suits and Sunday sermons. Threes. It comes with a hymn book in one hand and a contract in the other. Threes. It comes not screaming but singing. Threes. And that's what this video is about. Threes. Not just revealing the horror. Threes. But asking you to look around to wonder what else we've been taught to forget. Threes. Because if even one of those forgotten names belonged to someone like you, would you stay silent, or would you speak if this story shook you? Say something. Threes. Drop a comment. Threes. Share what part hit you the hardest. Threes. Save this video because you may want to revisit it when the next forgotten church makes headlines. Threes. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Threes. Not just to support this channel, but to be part of something bigger. A community that refuses to let history lie quietly. Threes. Because the only thing more terrifying than what happened is pretending it never did. Threes. So ask yourself, who's still writing the next ledger, and will you be watching?